We're going to kick off the show by tackling some national news as recent aviation incidents all across the nation are putting extra eyes on air traffic control and their pilots. The Federal Aviation Administration is investigating a near miss between a private jet and a Southwest Airlines plane Tuesday morning in Chicago. You can see some footage right now on our screen if you're watching on Civic Center TV. But the video shows that Southwest Flight 2504 nearly touching down at Midway International Airport before taking off again to avoid a jet that was crossing its path on the runway. The FAA said the jet entered the runway without authorization, prompting the Southwest crew to initiate what's called a go-around to avoid a collision. The airline confirmed in a statement that the flight landed safely at Midway after the precautionary manner, but still a very scary situation, and it seems as though it's just the latest in a recent series of aviation accidents and mishaps that has had some travelers unnerved and anxious. Here to tell us more and to share his perspective on these recent mishaps, we have local pilot Joe Cook joining us right now on The Splash. Joe, good morning.
Good morning.
Happy to have you with us and happy to be getting into this very, very important conversation with all of the recent news surrounding these air traffic mishaps. What has your reaction been to everything you've seen?
Well, there's been a string of accidents that have been very highly publicized, but we have to keep in context just how rare these accidents really are. There was the accident, the mid-air collision over the Potomac, which, unfortunately resulted in the loss of 60 lives. But prior to that, the last fatal event in a commercial airline was back in 2019 when one person was killed on a Alaska flight that overran the runway. And then prior to that, I believe it was 2012, there was a regional turboprop crash in Boston, which resulted in a loss of life. And it also resulted in significant changes in training regulations through the FAA and sleep regulations, that sort of thing. So I know these kind of events concern people, and rightfully so, but they're news splashes, and I think they should be kept in context with the fact that while we're having this several-minute conversation, there's probably 5,000 airplanes take off and land around the world, and it happens every hour without any incident.
That's certainly right. These incidents are very rare, and it's just surprising to see so many of them publicized in this way. Do you think the reason that so many are being publicized right now is because it's because of the initial incident and it's just becoming more and more common to talk about?
Certainly. After the crash over the Potomac, then there was the Delta incident at Reagan, and then there was that midair out in Arizona, and certainly the midair in Arizona probably wouldn't have even got national coverage if it hadn't been for the concern that's going on over aviation safety right now. It's a news cycle, and people want to hear it, and that's not to minimize whatsoever the tragic events that have happened. But
of course,
if you look at the DOT information, Department of Transportation information, your chance of dying in an aircraft accident are about, let's say, I wrote it down here, 1 in 13.7 million, which if you're the one is, unfortunate, but it's certainly the safest way to travel. If you compare it to driving, 95% of the transportation fatalities that happen throughout the year happen driving. About 1% over a long period of time happen in aviation. It's clearly the safest way to fly. I've been flying small airplanes for 50 years, and I'm currently training pilots out at Troy Airport there at Coolidge at 15, and I've got over 3 million miles on Delta, so I'm in those airplanes quite a bit, and I'm not concerned about it. I'm taking my 8-month-old daughter to Philadelphia next month on a commercial flight on Delta, and I wouldn't be doing it if I felt there was a risk.
That's absolutely right. You have a lot of experience in this world of air traffic control and with piloting planes. And as a commercial pilot who sometimes flies around other jets in the air, what is the protocol for navigating shared airspace?
Well, the key word there is that it's shared airspace. A guy landing at Pontiac or Metro or anywhere else in a 4-seat Cessna has got the same right to be doing that as Delta, A330 or something. Now, from a practical standpoint, most pilots, if they're just going to go out and practice shooting landings, aren't going to go to Metro they're going to go to maybe Pontiac or Flint, something like that. But as far as the communication that they use between ground control and the tower and center and the various type of communication outlets that pilots use, everybody's got the same right to be there, and they do mix, and they mix well. And most guys that are flying small airplanes are aware of the fact that the logistics and the requirements for 737 are different than for a Cessna 172, and they take that into consideration when they're planning their flights and where they're going to go. Generally, if I'm like, I flew a small airplane back from Florida last week, and I made a point of making my stops at smaller non-towered airports rather than going into Atlanta or Chattanooga or somewhere like that.
Yes, very interesting information and good to have this perspective. And I would imagine, because I'm certainly not a pilot, I would imagine being in that situation as you're flying that plane and hearing all these multiple perspectives as you're navigating the air, it can be a bit challenging. What is it like to be managing all of these things at once as you're operating commercial aircraft?
If somebody that isn't involved in aviation tunes into one of the internet sites where you can hear aircraft communications, either from ground or tower or center, it can sound, yes, very confusing. And how could anybody ever understand what they're saying? But if you're an experienced pilot and you've flown in that kind of airspace before, when you're contacted by air traffic control, ATC, you kind of anticipate what they're going to say. And so you kind of know what to expect. And if there's confusion, then you tell them to repeat or to clarify, and nobody's going to criticize you for doing that or think that you're not a smart pilot. If there's any confusion, they certainly want you to make that known. For example, that it was that on this recent Midway situation, the aircraft that caused the incursion was what's called a fractional jet, a small business jet that people could like rent by the hour, basically. He was leaving the spot where he picked up his passengers, got his taxi clearance, and you get that from what's called ground control. They're controlling all the movement of the airplanes on the ground. And there was some confusion about it, and he asked for a clarification. The ground controller gave him the proper clarification, but he didn't do what he was told to do. He was told to taxi. At Midway, they have parallel runways like many airports. So he was told to taxi past runway 31 left, and hold short of 31 center where the Southwest plane was landing. And he just didn't do it. He taxied straight across. It was just, he was distracted or he didn't understand. It's kind of hard to say it. I'm sure as they're researching the communication, they will be able to determine that. What I think I would like to add to that is the real kudos should go to the Southwest pilots on this, because go-arounds are not particularly unusual. But typically what will happen is, because you can only have one airplane on the runway at a time. So even if a guy's at the end of the runway and about ready to turn off, if he's not completely off the runway, the other airplane can't land. So what will typically happen is maybe the guy that's already on the runway is slow getting off the runway, or the guy coming in is coming in a little fast, and they have to have a certain amount of separation. The tower will tell the approaching airplane to take off and go around, just come around the pattern once and land again. In this case, it was the Southwest pilots that initiated the go around. So they saw that there was an incursion. They saw this guy was across the runway in front of them. So without being directed by the tower, they just initiated the go around. So they were on their toes. And because in that segment of flight, it's very easy to be, directed at what you're doing and looking at your instruments and preparing for the landing, but they were keeping their spatial orientation intact. They saw the airplane and they did the go around and saved a possible tragedy.
That's absolutely right. Those Southwest pilots were heroes and did the absolute right thing in helping get that plane to land safely. And Joe, you have a lot of experience with commercial planes, but you also have experience flying seaplanes, and those can be very different. What are some of the biggest differences in operating seaplanes and operating commercial airlines?
Well, when you're operating, I own an amphibious aircraft, which I probably have annoyed some people over on Wall Lake and Orchard Lake by practicing. I go over there and practice landings. The difference is when you're landing, like out of Troy Airport or Pontiac Airport, you're taking off on a runway that's not changing. It's concrete, and you're taking off the same runway every time you go. Where when you're landing on a lake or any body of water, the water is different. You know, the wind's coming from different directions. It's causing ripples. It's causing various waves from boats and from the wind itself. And the other concern always is that at an airport, you pretty much know and you can see very well who's on the runway or who's approaching the runway, or if you're landing at a controlled field, they're going to tell you who's approaching the runway and if you're cleared to land. When you're landing on a lake, you've got, you know, paddle boarders and other boats and although, you know, a lot of other activity. So it can be a bit more challenging making sure that everything's safe. But the actual operation of the airplane, once you're off the ground, it flies pretty much like any other airplane. Just it's one of those airplanes you can land on the water more than once.
Well, it's very fascinating to hear about all of these differences, and very fascinating to hear about your perspective on these recent mishaps that have happened all across America. Joe, one more quick question before we let you go. What are some of the biggest safety perspectives that people can look at with observing these recent mishaps?
Well, I think they should keep in mind that statistically, clearly, aviation is the safest way to fly. You're much more inclined to be in a car accident than you are in an aircraft accident. I read one statistic one time that if the day you were born, if you flew every minute while you were alive, you'd be involved in an aircraft accident when you were 54 years old. So it would be nice if we could say that absolutely, you get on an airplane, you're going to get where you want to go without having any problems. That's probably not realistic, but certainly people should not be apprehensive about getting on an airplane due to the recent and well-publicized string of aviation events that have occurred. And again, if one that happens is a tragedy, and we hate to see it happen, but the reality of our life and our world is that sometimes things are going to happen, and it's unfortunate. But always keep in mind that the pilot is the guy that's making the guy in the left seat is the guy that's making the ultimate decision. And if there's an accident, he's going to be the guy that gets there first. So he wants to make sure that it's going to be a safe flight.
Very reassuring words. Joe Cook, we thank you so much for your time and joining us today on The Splash Live.
Thank you.